There's so much memory. Yeah.
You learn very easily.
This is an AJAX one.
If you work on it, you can't touch it. Right now, it's like 3 people working on it. And I don't want to always be
I did the front end, but I know enough electrical.
In the tundra world, in the world of tundra WordPress, you have to go in and write in PHP on the back end. That's the real.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. Excited to have you here. Sorry, I've got to get into my teaching voice. I don't talk this loud normally. So, all right. So tonight's class, we're going to continue with AJAX that we started last class. Once again, I forgot to hit that start button last class on the recording, so sadly I didn't get that magic that happened. But this weekend, I'm going to put together like a 30-minute run through the slides in its place. So hopefully, if you need a refresher, that will be useful. But we're going to continue on that material tonight. But first, what we're going to look at is a topic that is kind of more than due, which is debugging. We're getting to the point where our code is so complex and so intricate that we are spending a lot of time on small bugs without really having an appropriate toolbox to diagnose and fix those things quickly. So tonight, I hope to sort of, give you that toolbox and start introducing some of those tools that we can use to debug our JavaScript and hopefully, start developing quickly, more quickly, faster, whatever it is. All right, so that's the two topics we're going to talk about tonight, debugging first and then AJAX. We got a bunch of exercises. One we'll do together, and then a couple we'll do on your own. And then the homework this weekend is also going to be like a debugging exercise, where I give you some code that's a little bit unfamiliar, and the job is to go in there and to figure out what's wrong with it. So hopefully that'll be cool. So like I said, the first half will be focused on debugging, and then the second half we're going to talk more about AJAX and specifically how it applies to forms and how it applies to what we call event objects. And so how we can use those. First thing we're going to do, though, we're going to do just a little bit of review from last class. I'm going to do a quizzical quiz. So I have one prepared. It's not quite as long as the previous ones, I don't think. But as a reminder, how this works is we're going to go into, well, I'm going to start it in this quiz channel on Slack. Okay? I'm going to start the quiz. It's going to pose a question, and then you will answer that question in a direct message to Quizzical. Okay, so you'll answer in a direct message to Quizzical. All right, so I'm going to Quizzical start review. Okay, let's hope this still works. Okay, so here comes the first question. What can HTTP be used for? Hypertext Transfer Protocol, what can that be used for? And remember to submit your answer by direct messaging Quizzical.
This direction.
Remember to answer in a direct message. I'll give you another few seconds here, and then we'll have to manually go to the second question. And then after that, it'll go automatically.
So Quizzical checks the amount of people that answer the first one.
Correct.
So if I sat out the first one, but if I answer the first one, I'm responsible to answer all of them.
Yes, if you, yeah. Yes, that is right.
What if I get one wrong?
All right. Remember to do that in a direct message. Do you answer in a direct message?
Yeah. You shouldn't answer anything in the quiz channel.
Okay, are we ready? Everybody in? Anybody not in? Okay, perfect. I'm going to move on to the next one by typing in at Quizzical. Next. Okay, and so now it should continue the quiz in your direct message. And so you can just work on all the questions right in there. And as people finish up, it should progress us automatically. It looks like everybody got the first one right, so excellent job.
So.
Maybe what I should do is have, oh, I don't know. Can't really think of any way to fix this. Okay, so in the following URL, what is the, wait, what am I? Following URL, oh, what is A? Okay, got it. Okay, so everybody answered that one. So it was asking, what is this part of the following URL? Oops. So question 3, where in the HTTP request would be the best place to store information, put information about authentication? So where in an HTTP request is the best place to put information about authentication? Remember to answer in a direct message. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, question 4. What is the format most commonly used to communicate between client and server? So what format, what data format, is most commonly used to communicate between client and server? All right, question 5. What is not a valid value type in JSON data? Which of these things is not a valid value type in JSON data? Okay, people still finishing up question 5. Okay, question 6. What does the put method, PUT, what does the put method mean in HTTP? All right, question 7. When is a callback function needed? When do we need to use a callback function? Or at least in what situation have we talked about that we need a callback function? Okay, last one, I do believe. What makes an asynchronous function different than a synchronous one? What makes an asynchronous function different than a synchronous one? When I say that out loud, it almost sounds like I'm saying asynchronous twice. Aww. Okay, everybody get question 8 in, and we will go back through the whole shebang. All right, there we go. Oh, everybody got that right. Perfect. Let's see what the average score here was. Only a few there in the middle that were 83. Nice job. All right, so let's just start from the top. Well, I'll spend less time on the ones that everybody got right, but I do want to just mention them all. So the first one, what can HTTP be used for? Well, we talked about all these things. The first one, we can use it to send and receive JSON data, right? And what does that stand for? Yeah, somebody. JavaScript object notation, right. And we call it that because it looks very much like objects in JavaScript, but it's a data format. It's a way of sending and receiving data. It's not actually code, per se. It's data. HTML for a website. Of course, we can do that. We saw that we can, when we type in an address into our address bar, that's making an HTTP request for the HTML of a web page. And so we can totally do that. And also we saw that once we load that initial web page, as the browser goes through that web page and begins to request using HTTP all of the other assets, JavaScript, CSS, images, etc. Fonts probably. So all of those things can be transferred via HTTP. In fact, any data can be transferred via HTTP. So long as it can be written out, it can be transferred via HTTP. Okay, everybody got that right, so I won't spend too much time on it. In the following URL, what is api.openweathermap.org? Okay, what is that portion of this URL called? And of course, it's called the host, right? That's the host. This first part here is what? The protocol, correct? This part we identified as the host. What part of the URL are we not using here? Which part of the URL are we not using here? What optional part of the URL have we left off of this? The port, exactly. We haven't specified a port here. That would be a colon after the host and then a number, right? So what port are we saying that we want by leaving that off? 80, right? Port 80 is the default port for HTTP if it's left off. This next part is called the path. Yep, that's right. And then finally, this portion here after the question mark is a query string, or query parameters. All of those things are right. Yeah, exactly. So that's sort of the anatomy of a URL. Question 3 here is where in an HTTP request would be the best place to put information about authentication? So we identified one specifically in the slides last class, and that is what? Yeah, the header. So generally, what are the headers for an HTTP request, or response for that matter? What's that? So what are headers, like generally? What are they used for? Yeah, data about the request. It's sort of describing the request. It's not the request itself, right? It's sort of data about it, metadata. That's what we call it, and that's where we normally store, authentication information. You potentially could put it in the body of the request, but most often it's put in headers because it's not really what we're trying to communicate. It's just some information that we need in addition to the actual information we're trying to communicate. So we already saw what the URL is. What is the method? What is an HTTP method? Yeah, so you're naming them individually, but what do they sort of signify?
I don't know the current terminology. I just know that they're requests.
Yeah, just like this. But can you describe what do those requests mean to a server when we use those verbs? So generally, what they mean is like that's the action that we want to take. That's the action that we want to take on the server. Okay. So a GET request, for instance, means we want to read some data from a server. So it's sort of showing our intent with this request. Do we want to read something, create something, etc. And finally, the body we talked about is the actual data of the request itself. The payload, sometimes people call that, but the body is the official term. All right, question 4. What is the format most commonly used to communicate data between client and server? Most people got this right. JSON is now the most common data format. It hasn't always been. As we saw when we started talking about AJAX, the word AJAX itself has XML in it, right? Because when it was created in 2005, that happened to be the most dominant data format. So it's kind of fallen to the wayside, especially because JavaScript has gotten so popular, and JSON and JavaScript are just sort of a natural fit together. So JSON happens to be, especially in new applications, the most common data format. Yes.
Just out of curiosity, like when the internet was first established, what language was used for that? JSON.
Yeah. So when the internet was first established, remember, it's much earlier than the 90s. That was like the ARPANET in the 70s. And at that point in time, the data they were sending over was just binary data, zeros and ones, right? Completely unformatted data, just raw data over the wire. And then once the web came around, that's what you're referring to, the web came up in the 90s, all we were communicating was HTML pages. So there was no need for a data format to send and receive information. We just sent HTML directly, yeah. And that's why it got this name, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, because originally it was only used for HTML files.
But like if I was a phone user, I wanted to see a website, some kind of request.
You were making a request just for HTML.
What is that like? Saying I want to say.
So the HTML itself is in the response body. You don't need to send any additional information. So when I talk about a data format here, I'm saying like how do we send and receive raw data like as the application is progressing, like as it's going on. Not for that like initial request, we're just loading a web page. There's a distinction there, but they both happen to be data that we put in a body of a request or response. So there was nothing in addition to that. It was all HTML. So, I mean, HTML and JavaScript here, yes, those are sent in HTTP requests, but they aren't what we consider like a data format necessarily. They're, a markup language and a programming language, right? So it's sort of different. Okay, what is not a valid value type in JSON data? It's like most people got this right. The only thing that we can't easily represent in JSON is a function. Everything else we can easily represent in JSON. And when you think about JSON, it's really like, it's just a string that looks like a JavaScript object. I mean, that's really how we think about JSON. It's just a string that looks like JavaScript values. So you think about how would you turn a function into a string? Well, that's sort of difficult to do, and in fact, it's impossible to do. And so we don't ever put functions in JSON. It's not part of the data format. Basically, every other value, though, is valid in JSON, including arrays, numbers, booleans, objects, strings, and null. All right. What does the put method mean in HTTP? Well, we already identified that get means a read. We want to read some information from a server. So put means what? Update, yes. Put means to update some information on a server, whereas a post is to create some data on a server. So, for instance, if I'm going to comment on, on a blog post, say, I'm going to comment on that. When I, submit that comment, that's going to create a post request to create that comment on the server. If I then notice a typo and I want to edit that comment and fix that typo, when I save that edit, that would be a put request updating that comment. You see what I'm saying? So the initial creation of that comment would be a post request to create the comment, create that data. A put request would be generated when I go to edit that request and change it and modify it in some way. Finally, a delete is pretty obvious, right? That's just to remove it. So if I go to delete that comment because I said something bad in a moment of weakness and I decided to take it down, I could do that, and that would generate a delete request. Questions about that? Okay, moving along here. When is a callback function needed? I think everybody got this right. The primary use case for a callback function, the one that we talked about last class, is when the function that we're calling is asynchronous. Okay. So when we're doing something asynchronous, we need a callback function in order to inform us, okay, when did that asynchronous function finish? Okay. When can we be certain that the asynchronous function has completed its job? Okay. And then we said, okay, well, what does that mean? What does asynchronous function mean? And the answer here is asynchronous function allows the code to continue without completing. Right? So when we make an AJAX request, for example, we initiate that request, and then the program moves on to other things, and then eventually that completes, and that's when we call our callback function. Okay, so asynchronous things allow our code to continue. What we're used to seeing is line by line. Each line will complete before moving on to the next line. Asynchronous functions don't do that. They say, keep going, I'm going to go do my business over here. I'll let you know when I'm finished. Okay. All right, so any question about that? Well, I'm actually going to go into that a little bit more. Just want to, I think this is a very sort of pivotal piece of JavaScript understanding, so I just really want to discuss it one more time. Basically, the same stuff we talked about last class, but really drive it home. So here, this is a specific use case for a callback function, right? And this is using the AJAX jQuery.get function that we talked about last class. So this is a function in the jQuery library that allows us to do AJAX requests and AJAX GET requests specifically. And this first parameter is a string, the URL that we want to request. The second parameter is a function. A function, a callback function, that is invoked or called when the AJAX request completes. So not only does that let us know when it's done, not only can we be sure when it's done, but we also get access to whatever that response was. And that's really key, right? If we're going to make a request for some data, then we need to be able to see that data, right? Question?
This is a jQuery. Okay. Is there a way to do that in JavaScript?
Yes, there is. Yeah, so there is a way. You do it using that XML HTTP request object that I mentioned briefly last class. It's, this is a single line here. To do that with the XML HTTP request object would be probably like 15 lines of code. I mean, it's, fairly verbose to use, but yes, you do it in, just much the same way that you can do anything else in jQuery with regular JavaScript. Yes. So the XML HTTP request object itself is asynchronous. Its functions are asynchronous, which is where the asynchronous. Yeah, whatever it is. I can't, that's hard to say. But that's why this is asynchronous, is because the underlying XML HTTP request object is asynchronous. Right? So that's where that comes from.
So this is just way easier.
This is what we would call syntactic sugar. That's what people typically call this thing. It's not really changing anything about the functionality. It's just a much cleaner, nicer way to write it. Right? So it's syntactic sugar is what people often refer to that as. So, so again, why do we need this? Because the get function and all of the AJAX functions we'll see are asynchronous. They allow the code to continue without completing. And we identified two other things that were asynchronous that we looked at so far. The first of which was event listeners, right? Event listeners, they don't, invoke that event, right? When we call the .on, they wait for that .on, that click to happen, at some point in the future, right? And so we can pass them a callback function that gets invoked whenever that click happens. Same situation that we see here. The other one we saw was game prompt. Right? Game prompt is a function that accepts a string or list of strings as the first argument, and the second one is a function to run when the user enters that information, hits enter. Right? That's a callback function. So game prompt itself is asynchronous. It waits for the user to hit that enter button at some point in the future. All right. Again, this is what we have, see most of the time are these synchronous functions, right? Here we're just doing simple addition. When we get to the line after calling this function, this whole function has been completed, right? We've done that addition. We've gotten the result. It's all done. On the next line. When we're using an asynchronous function, that's not the case. So here on this line, after our AJAX request, the AJAX request has not completed. It's only been initiated. Right? So if we try to do anything with, like, say, the response data here, nothing will happen. We won't have access to it. And so here, inside of our callback function, we know that it's done, and we have access to the data from that response question.
I like asking all these questions.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
So with the synchronous function, is it faster?
Yes, yes. And I mean, you'll know if you're writing an asynchronous function because there are only a few things in JavaScript that are capable of making asynchronous functions, right? One of them being the XML HTTP request object, AJAX calls. That's one thing. Event listeners are another thing. There's maybe one or two other things that are capable of doing that, but for the most part, most functions are this sort of synchronous operation. Any more questions about callbacks? Yeah.
So is any of the data that's generated in the AJAX request, you can't get it outside, you can't access it outside of that function?
So is this data that comes from the AJAX response, can we access that outside of the callback function? Is that your question? Well, so we can't access this data parameter, right? Because this data parameter is scoped inside this function, right? So when we talk about local scope, that parameter here is scoped inside this function. So we couldn't access data out here. However, we could create a variable here in the containing scope, the container scope, I should say, up here, and then we could assign information from this into this variable up here, right? And that way we can hold on to that data after the callback is finished. And we have done that. That's what we did for our to-dos, right? When we got that response back, we put part of the data that we got back from the response into our model. right? So that's how we can keep hold of the data after the callback function has completed. It depends. Yeah, it depends. If it's in the same function,
If it's outside the scope.
if it's out, yeah, if it's here, right?
Yeah.
And they're both in the same containing scope, you technically could.
But it's not good practice.
It's not generally a good idea because it's not, visually it looks kind of weird. It's not intuitive.
To me, it looks weird when it's above it, it's saying go back.
Well, yeah. What we're doing though is just creating the variable, right? We're not, contain it. Yeah, it's a good question. We'll talk about something called variable hoisting briefly in a couple weeks, and that's really relevant to that question.
Okay.
Okay, more questions about this? All right, we're gonna move into a new topic 1 of the day, debugging. So just gonna spend a little time giving a backstory because I think it's fun and it gives me an opportunity to talk about some stuff that I'm interested in. So forgive me, but I'm gonna take it back to where this term comes from. And so if you were in my previous class, forgive me, but a lot of this will be with you. So this is a woman by the name of Grace Hopper. She was an admiral in the Navy during World War II. So while Alan Turing was in England doing his thing across the pond, Grace Hopper was leading a very similar team decrypting messages using the Mark I computer. Much of her work happening right here in Virginia. Oh, well, I guess in Virginia, not here, but. So, she, very remarkable computer scientist. She's actually credited with creating the first computer language compiler. So until she wrote the compiler, everybody was writing in what we would call like assembly code, which is very hard to read and very hard to write as a human that doesn't speak computer, right? So she created the first sort of compiler program that enabled writing of higher level languages that are easier for humans to read. She also was creator of a language called Cobalt, which is perhaps, not even perhaps, it is the most widely used language ever. It's still around today. It's used primarily in like financial software and security software, but it's been around since just after World War II. That language has been around, and she was in large part the person who created that language. Yeah. Well, I think probably the primary reason is because those fields are the slowest to move. And this language has been around. It's been very heavily vetted, for a long time, decades. It's been vetted, right? And yeah, and especially, if you think about like financial software where lots of things, money is at stake, right? It's very difficult to change that. So Cobalt was responsible for the 2000 bug, whatever it was called, Y2K, in large part because it had some things in there where they never really anticipated getting to the year 2000 with that language. But in any case, so that's interesting. She's really amazing. I encourage you to read about her. But the important part for today is slightly later, she was working on a computer called Mark II, which is an evolution on the Mark I. Here's a picture of it. You've probably heard stories about how these computers took up, full rooms in that day and age. Here is a picture of a Mark II. So she was leading a team working on the Mark II computer called Colossus, and one day it stopped working, right? So something wasn't working properly, and so they went around looking at the computers, what's wrong? Well, these things are big mechanical devices at the time. They're not digital devices. They're all analog. They have these, big vacuum tubes and mechanical levers that slap down and create circuits and all this stuff. And what they found was there was actually a moth in one of the circuits that was causing, a short circuit or something of that nature that was causing the whole thing to not work. So they took this bug out or debugged the Mark II, and the term debugging was sort of born from there. This moth, by the way, is in the Smithsonian, so you can go check it out if you want to see it. And yeah. Was an actual bug, yes. So the legend goes, I will disclaim. Now, so another thing that I like to talk about, because this is just like a good time for it in the course, is women in computing. So I want to just talk about two more inspirational figures for me that are important to computing history, often don't get as much attention as they deserve. And probably the most important person in all of computing, all of software, is Ada Lovelace. She was the daughter of Lord Byron, the poet. So she was, a very good writer. She wrote prolifically about computers and computer thinking. Long before it was even a real concept. She worked with a guy named Charles Babbage on a machine called the analytical machine, and he was using a lot of these ideas that Turing came up with, and other people of that nature, at a later time. And it was a general purpose machine, and she took it and wrote the first program for that machine, the analytical machine, and that program was to create Bernoulli numbers. Math people help me out, but she's very much considered sort of the first computer programmer. She took this general purpose computer, the very first one, the analytical machine, and wrote this program for it. And not only that, but she had a bunch of beautiful writing about like how these machines might be used in the future. Very inspirational stuff. Another person that is yeah.
So was it an actual machine, or was it just like a...
No, it was an actual machine. So he had one called the difference engine first. And that one had a specific purpose to compute, differential equations or something of that nature. And then after that, he was like, wow, why don't I take this and make it more general? And that's when they came up with the analytical engine. I was calling it analytical machine. Analytical engine, which was a more general purpose engine, but it needed programs, right? So the first one was just hard made to solve one set of problems. The analytical engine was made to be a general purpose machine, and so it needed somebody to write these programs to solve specific problems. And so really, she was the person who did that. It's pretty awesome. So this next person, Adele Goldberg, so she was working at a place called Xerox PARC. Anybody heard of Xerox PARC? Super influential sort of think tank. It was the R&D department of Xerox, the scanning company. But it, very much was on the level of like Bell Labs or even Google X. You think about today, sort of these like very high bar research departments. While there, she created a language called Smalltalk, which happens to be the first language to ever use object-oriented programming as a concept. And that's sort of where all modern languages have stemmed from. C++ is an object-oriented language. JavaScript has aspects of object-oriented programming, and all of that comes from Smalltalk. Yeah. No, I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sure you could probably find out, but I'm not sure. Another interesting tidbit is while at Xerox PARC, if you've read about Xerox PARC and maybe the founding of Apple computers, you know that Steve Jobs descended upon Xerox PARC, and the sort of higher ups demanded that they show off their technology, and she refused initially, and rightly so, because after they eventually did show them, they basically took it all and created what is now the biggest company in the world. So, they had the first user interface there. What's that?
Google's or whatever they call it.
Okay, well, sure. But they had the first user interface at Xerox PARC. They had this awesome language called Smalltalk, which, yeah, it's a graphical user. Thank you. Graphical user interface, and basically, Apple took those and implemented them directly when they were creating their first computers. Yeah. So, anyways, I just wanted to talk about a couple really cool figures that I encourage you to learn more about. And if you want to do so, this is a really great book, The Innovators by Walter Isaacson. He's an awesome biographer. He did like sort of the canonical Steve Jobs biography and Einstein biography, etc. he wrote this book. It's a sort of a history of computing, but it's very heavily focused on Ada Lovelace specifically, and how her predictions and her writings, there's a thread of them throughout the whole history of computing. So I really do encourage you to read that book. So it's interesting, right, that we had all of these really prolific computer scientists as part of the founding of this profession and of this line of study. But we have to face reality. It's a male-dominated profession now, right? It's just, there's no question about that. And if we look at this is a graph from NPR. What you'll see here is some various science majors, majors, and the percentage of women in that major over time. So this is the 1960s. This is today, or last year, a few years ago. And what you'll see is right here in 70, this red line just kind of drops off. And that's computer science. And in large part, what we think that's attributed to is the introduction of the personal computer. So when the personal computer first came out, all of the marketing was heavily targeted towards young men. And because of that, young men were introduced to computing at a younger age. And by the time they got to college, women oftentimes felt behind because they hadn't grown up with computers like a lot of the young men did. And so, unfortunately, what happened is people began to get discouraged, and the profession became more and more male-dominated as time went on. So, we're working very hard to right that ship. You see it levels off here, and hopefully it'll start increasing again. But that's sort of where that trend comes from. If you want to learn more, there's a great episode of Planet Money, a podcast about this. Yeah, please do. And it goes into that in a little more depth. All right, spiel over. Sorry about that, but I like talking about that stuff. And I think it's important that we keep that top of mind. All right, now into the coding stuff. Let's talk about debugging. So when we start debugging, what we really need to do first is kind of classify the type of issue we're having. There's sort of two big classes of issues we might have. One is like nothing's happening, right? Okay, everything seems broken. And this is what we might call like an error, or might say like syntax error. And there's one strategy to sort of address those problems. Another thing that we might have happen is like, okay, there's a flaw in our logic, right? Something is, we want something to move left and it moves right, or we want something to count up and it goes down, right? Those are sort of simple examples, but that's the type of error we have when we're looking at problems with logic. So there are different types of errors. One's like, I've written something syntactically wrong, or I've used the language in a way it wasn't supposed to be used, right? And the other type is, okay, I've just got a problem in my thinking, a flaw in my thinking, or in my logic, or something of that nature. There's different ways we might attack those things. Generally speaking, if we have the former category, the syntactic error, the problem with the language error, well, we'll often see errors in the console, and those are sort of breadcrumbs that help us find what's going on and the issues that we're having in our code. For the other type of issue, it's a little trickier. If there's a flaw in our logic, we have to track down exactly where that flaw occurs. And the console's not going to really do us much good. It's not going to tell us where that is automatically. So we're going to have to track it down. And that's when we start using some of the more advanced features of Chrome DevTools. So let's talk about that first category of errors. So I call them runtime errors here. They're errors that happen because we're using the language incorrectly. I'll talk about the most common kinds we see and what they mean, because it'll help a little bit. Oftentimes you can not really know exactly what it means and still figure out the problem, but it might help a little bit to understand what the errors mean individually. So the first and probably most common type of error we'll see is called a reference error. Okay? And this type of error occurs when we reference a function or a variable that has not been declared or defined. Right? So if we reference here the variable c, where we've never defined that variable above, we never had var c anywhere above, then this code here will throw a reference error. It'll say reference error, c is not defined, or something similar to that. Yeah.
You'll see, like, if you look at it in the console,
Correct. Then you'll see exactly this text or something very, very similar to this text. Yeah, in the console in red. And we'll look at this in a second. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's what a reference error means. It means we're trying to reference some variable here that has not been declared or defined. Okay, the next category is a syntax error. Okay, so this is the kind of error that's all too common and all too frustrating when we have sort of a stray comma or a missing comma or a missing close parenthesis or a curly bracket, or we forgot to end a string or things of that nature, where it's just sort of mistakes in the punctuation type of thing. That's what we call a syntax error. And how syntax errors usually appear, it says syntax error unexpected token, and then it'll say, okay, I got to this thing and I didn't know what to do. Okay, so generally we can either know that this is the problem, or we can work backwards and say, okay, something happened right before that token or symbol that caused the JavaScript to not work. Okay, so in this case, we put a semicolon here between properties and object when we should have put a comma. Yeah. So in an object, we have to separate the properties, the key value pairs, with a comma instead of with a semicolon. Semicolons come at the end of a line rather than inside of an object. Yeah.
Let's say you create a function called like sum.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you call the function, you spell it C-H-E-K.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a syntax error. You spell it right. The feedback is going to be checksum.
Well, the feedback will be reference error. Checksum is not defined because you spelled it wrong. So you're referencing something that has never been defined. So yeah, I mean, it's not always going to be the most obvious or the most useful error message, but you know that it'll at least point you in the right direction and say, here's where the issue is. But yes, in that case, with typos, that's often the case of reference error. Almost always the case will be a reference error. With a typo in like a word, say. All right, the next type, and I think the last one, type errors. And this is when we try to use one value type as if it were another value type. Now, this is the most common case, probably the only time you'll ever encounter this type error, is when you try to use some value like a function when it is not a function. Okay, so here we have this variable I, and we're assigning it the value 0, which is what type? A what? Integer number, more generally. It's a number, but on this line we're trying to call it with parentheses as if it were a function. Okay? So a number is not a function, thus it cannot be called. And this code here will throw an error. It'll say type error, I is not a function. Okay, so those are the three most common errors that we'll encounter in our code. Let's go ahead and look at some of those in the wild. Okay, so we're going to do that by looking at this first sort of level of debugging, and that is we're just going to check the console, the Chrome Developer Tool console, for red errors. Okay, you've all probably done this at some point already in this class, but we're going to do it together and start looking at how to use that information. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to get the starter code. And inside of the starter code, there's going to be some buggy code for us to debug. All right. So I'm in the terminal. Once again, if you need the instructions for this, they are in the GitHub repo, line by line. All right, so I'm going to CD to make sure I'm in my home directory, and then CD into documents. All right. Once I'm in Documents, I'm going to cd into JX-DC2. And inside there, I'm just going to get pull. Get the latest changes. Okay, so we just get pulled. And now I'm going to cd up one level, go back into Documents. And I'm going to make a directory, make dir, inside Jacob's JS repo. And I'm going to call it class 11. Oops, class 11. All right, and then we're just going to copy cp-r from JSDC2, 11 debugging in AJAX, starter code. And we're going to copy that to Jacob's JS repo, class 11. Okay. Then we're going to cd into Jacob's JS repo, class 11. Oh, and then one more enter starter code. And finally, I'm going to subl dot. Open that directory in Sublime. Okay. So again, if you got behind on those, all of the commands are in the cat class repo, line by line. You could just copy it from there. Everybody else got this? Oops. Show for one more second. Okay. So what we're going to look at first is we're going to look at buggy countly. So we're going to go into, we'll just go into the index, and we're just going to open it in the browser. So we're in buggy countly. We're going to open the index here in a browser. So this is basically the application we worked on for homework this past weekend. But there's been a bunch of bugs introduced, and we're going to use some of these techniques, together to figure out what's going on here. So again, what we notice here when we first open this page is, nothing's happening, right? We don't even see that initial 0 being rendered. None of the buttons seem to do anything. This has all the signs of being some sort of, error, some type of syntax or type of reference error. So let's go ahead and open the Chrome Developer Tools by right-clicking and hitting Inspect, or you can Command Option J in order to open the console. So Command Option J, and it's different on Windows, but forgive me, I don't have it memorized. Okay, so let me zoom this in. So what we notice right away when we open the console is that we've got this up in the right-hand corner, this red X. So that signifies that there is one error in the console. So, if we happen to be in the Elements tab, say, we can see, oh, there's one error in the console. Let's go check it out. We also see here an error message, uncaught syntax error. Okay, so this is the second kind of error, unexpected identifier. On the right-hand side here, we get two pieces of information. We get the file, where that error occurred, index.js. And we get the line number where the error occurred. In this case, line 13. Okay, so it's saying in your index.js file on line 13, you've got a problem. You've got an unexpected identifier. So we could do two things. One is we could go into our directly right back into Sublime, check it out there, find line 13 and see what's going on. Another thing we can do is we can actually just click this. It's a link, and it will take us to that file in the DevTools. So we can see, right here, there's line 13. Okay? So what do we notice when we look at line 13? Anything weird going on there? Yeah, there's a missing comma right before it. So what's happening here is this line is being read, that line looks good, but then it's getting to the next line without seeing a comma and saying, oh, you got a problem here. We needed a comma. And so let's go ahead and fix that. We'll go back to Sublime. We'll go into our index.js file. So buggy countly js index.js. And here we are, line 12, there's a missing comma. So let's go ahead and add that. And once we do, we'll go back to the browser and we'll just refresh. Okay. So, still nothing going on up here. And if we look over here, it's saying we've got a few things going on in the console. So we got a couple things going on here. The first one is saying, well, something weird here, but if you look on the next line, it says reference error, decrement is not defined. Okay. And this link is less helpful because you'll notice this is saying the problem actually happened inside of jQuery. Not especially helpful. But what we can maybe do is look here and we'll see, here's a line that looks helpful. And you'll see this is index.js, line 26. And this second number here is actually the column number, so column 27. So it'll tell us very specifically where that happened. And okay, so we know we got an issue here. And if I click that link, once again, it'll take me to the file and to where the problem occurred. Now, do you see an issue here? Yeah, decrement is spelled wrong. We accidentally typed M twice. And so, like I said, that gave us a reference error because that function has not been defined. So we can go ahead and save that. Oh, well, actually, we have to edit in Sublime. So if we go back to Sublime, we'll see on line 26, we've got decrement spelled wrong.
Increment decrements they're all jQuery functions.
Oh, no, these are functions that we've defined down below. Yep. Okay, so now let's go back and we'll refresh one more time. Okay, well, we're still not seeing anything. When we click this, we had another issue. So when I first loaded, when I first refreshed, well, a little bit better. Our console is now clear of errors. We don't see anything, but at least we don't have any errors down here. Well, now I can start clicking on things. Those buttons don't do anything, but when I click that one, uncaught type error, count is not a function. So type error count is not a function. I can see that's happening in the index.js on line 31. So go ahead and see if you can figure that one out by yourself. Occasionally, when you click that link, it also underline in red the problem code. It's not always able to do that, but when it can, it will. All right, so did everybody figure out what the issue was? Did somebody explain it to me? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because what type is count? Well, it's a variable that has what value type inside of it? It has a number. Yeah, number. Right, so a number can't be called like a function, and thus we need to get rid of those parentheses. And we can do that. Save. Okay, let's come back and we'll refresh one more time. Okay, once again, no console errors. Click on these, no errors. Okay, so now there's something wrong still, obviously. We're not seeing the number, but we're done with the, there's no more errors happening. So now it's gotta be some sort of flaw in our logic, okay? So let's go back to the slides for a moment and then we'll talk about how we can work with that. So once we have, gotten rid of all of those console errors, all those red errors in the console, the next thing we can do is we can add some console log statements of our own. Okay, so if we want to know, say, if a conditional is true, right? If this block of code is being run, we can add a console log statement in there saying, hey, I got to this point. So the program got to this point, and we will see that text in the JavaScript console, and then we can know, is the code getting to that point? We can also console log the values of various variables, right? So if we're unsure of what the value of a variable is at any given point in time, well, we can just console log it, run our program, or run our web page, and look in the console to see what the value of that variable is. So it's a way for us to kind of take a peek into the program as it's running. So just like in Node, when we use console log to communicate back to ourselves, we're doing the same thing here. We're writing console log in our code in order to communicate back to ourselves, hey, here's what's going on inside my program. Eventually, once we've figured out what's going on, we're going to remove those probably from our program. They're really for debugging purposes, not necessarily, we shouldn't necessarily keep them in there once we have it working. Okay, so let's give this a shot, all right? So we know that we've got no errors, but there's something wrong here, right? Something's not happening. So we're going to use console log to just kind of check the state of the program at various points in time to see if we can figure out what the issue is. So let's do that. So the first thing I might try is, well, we're not seeing anything. So let's say, is the setup function even being called? Is that function being called at all? Are we actually setting up our program? Well, we happen to know that we are because we encountered some other errors. But we'll pretend we don't know. And so we're going to, just at the top here, I'm going to say, made it to the setup function. Okay. So when we open our web page, if we see this message in the log, we know that this setup function got called. Okay? So we know that's not the problem. The setup function got called. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the browser and see what happens. So I'm going to refresh. Okay, made it to the setup function. Looking good so far. We know the setup function's running. Well, that's great. Well, the next thing we might check is okay, well now, is our render function being called, right? Because the render function is what's supposed to put a 0 there when the application first starts, but we don't see that 0. So the next good question we might ask is, well, is that render function being called? So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm just going to put a console.log, made it to render. Oops. Wow. All right, so I'm just going to put another console message up there for myself. You can see, okay, well, did we make it to the render function? If we go back to the browser, go ahead and refresh, and we see, okay, not only did we make it to the setup function, but shortly thereafter, we made it to the render function. All right, so we know that the appropriate functions are being called. So maybe it's an issue with our model. Maybe our model doesn't look exactly right. And when it's being passed to the template doesn't know what to do with it. So maybe that's the issue. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to that render count function, and I'm going to just log the model, in here to make sure it's what we think it is. So here the model is just this count number, okay? But I'm using that count number to construct this object. Right, so we're passing this full object with a count, a high, and a low property into the template function. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to actually take that function, that object there, and I'm going to log that whole object here. Okay. We're just going to log that whole object. Turns out you can log any value type to the console, and the console does a pretty good job of displaying it in a way that's readable. Okay, so we're just logging an object, the same object that we're going to pass into this template function. So we just want to make sure that, like, okay, is the count 0 like it's supposed to be? You know, are these both false like they're supposed to be at the beginning? Does everything look right at the start here? Okay, so I'm going to do that first. Another way I could have done this, right, is I could have created a variable here that said like template data and put the object in that variable. And then I could have logged the variable here and then passed the same variable to template. That would reduce some of the code, but you know, this is just for debugging, so not a big deal. Okay, so let's go back to the browser and refresh. Cool, so we see made it to setup function, made it to render, and then on the next line we see, oh, here's an object. Right, like we put an object in there, so it's saying, oh, we're logging an object that has a count key, value 0, high key, value false, low key, value false. Right? So this is exactly what we'd expect, right? So far, we still can't quite identify the issue. Okay, another thing we might check is, like, is our template being created correctly? Does our template look okay? So there's a number of ways we could do that, but let's just make sure that, like, the source is what we think it is. You know, is this source the actual template string that we want to use? If we look here, we know that that should be this. Yeah, well, if you've already identified some problems, you know, more power to you. But let's just go ahead and console log that source so we can see what, you know, what's going on there. So up here, I'm going to add another console log statement and log that source. Make sure it's what we think it is. So again, you can log sort of anything to the console that you want for inspection. Here we're just logging the source, which is an HTML string or a template string. So let's go ahead and refresh. And we see a couple things. We see that like we've been seeing. And now we also see our template there. And if we were to, like, look at this pretty quickly, we notice there are a couple issues just with the template itself, right? This should be span instead of sewn. We're using a closed LI here instead of a closed span. So maybe this would be more apparent now, you know, looking at it here in the console right in front of our face. So we'll go ahead and fix those two things. If we go back to the index, fix the span. It should be a closed span. Okay, the last thing we might check is, well, now we know what the source is, and we're getting the source properly. Like, there was an issue there, but we got it properly. Next thing we might ask ourselves is the template being rendered properly? Is the HTML getting filled in with our model in the proper way, right? And we create that HTML when we call the template function, and we're storing it here in this count HTML variable. So what can we do now in order to inspect, make sure that that template correctly rendered into HTML? Yeah, somebody said that. Yeah, let's just console log whatever's in this variable. Right? So what we'd expect this variable to have is a new string that looks very much like the template, except for the dynamic data placeholders have been filled in with the actual dynamic data. So let's add another console log statement. And here we're going to log whatever's in this variable count HTML. So let's go back to the browser and refresh. So done this right, done this right. This now looks good. Our object here looks right. And what we notice is this rendered template also looks right. but we still have an issue. So that issue can only be in one place. It has to be on line 23. Everything leading up to line 23 is right. So it has to be line 23. Well, we know the HTML function is what we want. You know, we want to replace the HTML somewhere. We know that this count HTML is right. It's a rendered template. It looks good. So the only thing that left that could be wrong is this selector. Right? That's the only thing left that we haven't already eliminated is this selector. So if we look at our index.html, the ID for this thing is count, not counts, plural. So we can go ahead and change this to count. So if we, yeah, question?
This may seem like a dumb question, but
Not at all.
it obviously probably matters where you're putting console log.
Yeah, yes, it does. So if I had done this one
Yeah.
on this line, but we haven't yet put that value into count HTML variable. So what do you think it would have been here if I had logged it? Well, what do you think? We would have seen something. You know what it would be? Undefined.
What
Exactly.
happens if you put an after the job jQuery? Or
If we put it, oops. Oh man, what am I doing? If I put it here,
yeah.
that would still work. It would still run that line.
Brackets.
If we put it outside, then we would get, do you know what would happen if we put it outside of the function?
I got undefined.
You got undefined as well?
I don't know why, maybe
Yeah, that might be right. I would expect it to be a reference error, but it could be.
reference area, it wasn't a reference area.
Okay, yes. So you get a reference error because that variable is created inside of this local scope and not in the larger global scope. All right. Okay, so now let's just make sure this works. Let me make sure to save this. And I'll go back to the browser. And lo and behold, we see our 0 now. And these things work. Oh, we got another issue here. That was weird, right? Seems a little strange. Going up works, but going down seems to do something strange. All right, so before we start diving into that one, let's talk about another way we can debug. But actually, first, it's been over an hour, so let's go ahead and take a break, and then we'll look at the last way of debugging and do an exercise.
I have many questions.
Okay? Many questions.
All right, so they'll have to do with Twitter.
Okay.
Yeah. So I got to this point, which is interesting. So you got the, have you ever done these? Well, obviously, since you do focus on product platforms, they're really application links all under the surface. What seems like the applicable thing?
Yeah.
So you have your consumer key, your consumer secret. I'm following the directions here. That's just how you put the query. So you have consumer key, consumer secret, and they want you to encode this into base64, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then are they sending? They're sending this to OAuth, okay, right?
Yep.
So they're making multiple requests in response just to get the OAuth key in the server.
Yes, that's right. OAuth is a mini-step process.
This is horrible.
Yeah,
I mean-
OAuth is very hard to use.
I think.
But you can find it.
I found a-
library. You know, that will handle a lot of this.
Really?
Yeah, almost
I was
everyone.
just gonna build it.
You can. I mean, and you'll learn a lot doing it, but in practice, most people would implement it themselves. And the primary reason is because every OAuth provider is a little bit different.
I mean,
In such a way that makes it very annoying.
so I found a WorkGPG version that's on this page. You know, in my mind, work similar like this is the step base.
Not always.
But you can use apparently a buffer
Yeah.
and just encode the string base before here.
Almost
So
always.
if I did this,
Not necessarily server software. Oh, but it
no, I'm
does.
doing it on the server. I don't I already figured out that I'm not doing this in the browser. So I'm taking these, concatenating them with a colon signal, basis for them.
That's a very common technique for the credentials that are somewhat obfuscated.
Yeah.
So, because the reason is when you send an HTTP request, the headers are visible. So
You want to do all that first, send
You
it
want-
obfuscated.
exactly.
Although you can undo a base64 fairly easily, right?
Yes, you can.
That's what I'm on. It doesn't matter to me. I don't really care for this case. If I was in your business doing it for the White House, I would care.
Yeah, that's also reason why I do HTTPS. HTTPS that whole job.
I don't. I'm not even sure. No, I'm just curious. I would probably say it was. So anyways, then I would use HTTP GET, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is
And they should screen and tell you what the question is.
well, they do, but I would be using this. I would first have to post to get the key, the response to the key itself. So it says you have to post to Twitter, api.twitter.com, token. Authorization of my 64 keys. Equals whatever, I'm assuming that's their client, this is the response. And this should be the response. This is my access token. So I should then call the access token the authorization here. And this is my actual get.
But that's an actual get to like
Right, using this token. So I have to make sure I have to write a function to convert to base 64. Then I have to post to get a temporary key. Then I use the key to make the actual request. And then I send and it returns JSON. I already did a curl example, so I did, they have a, so this is a curl example. Have them create.
Yeah.
And this is just, as you can see, an object. Status is on the search. I did already complete that. So then it would just start giving me data to work with, and then it's on me to set the object to the browser and then decipher the object using JavaScript.
Yeah, well, that should happen.
Well, not. What I meant is then display it in a human readable form.
That's right. I mean, you're on the way there.
Yeah. Well, I got a JSON response.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh god, this is difficult. Yeah. So I know how to implement it. I should have. Now you mentioned there might be a Twitter. Frankly, this is just like having on a why thing.
I'm trying to see, because you can do stuff. You know, like you can add breakpoints here. I want to learn how to use this. So I don't have to go to my IT. I can debug straight here, see it run, and then once I get the final product, I can like wait like fix it here, then run it again. So there's like, I know what the explains to me how MVC works. I'm like very lost. In the lesson, it's too hard deciding what to do. It's like you can just keep doing creative cool stuff. Live off those ages. The first 2 years.
Okay. Real quick. Those are another off. Actually, this is quick.
Yeah,
But usually, we describe any unfamiliar word.
those are just functions.
Actually, describing it are generally like testing.
Yeah, it's like that.
Testing this, like, actually, that's this is like a test. Kind of displayed that in a weird way. Okay, let's dive back in. So we've solved all of the like pressing issues. We've got numbers displaying, but we've still got some like logical issues, right? We've still got some problems where, you know, when we increment, it's going up by 1 like we'd expect. When we reset, it's going to 0 like we'd expect. But when we hit that negative button, that minus button, it's counting by 2 for some reason. So, you know, probably we could figure that out pretty easily without any debugging tools. But just for fun, we're going to use some more of the Chrome developer tools to look at this issue. So we've looked at, you know, 1, first let's get rid of those red error messages in the console. 2, we can add a bunch of console log statements in order to kind of just see what's going on at different points in our program, see what the value of variables are, etc. The next thing we can do is we can actually use that debugger tab, right? So there's a another tab in the Chrome Dev Tools here. The one we're interested in now is the Sources tab. Okay, so we've been on the console tab, and this is very much like Node in interactive mode, right? When you use the command line and you just type in Node and start that interactive mode, that's what this console is. I mean, we can do just like JavaScript here if we want. 1 + 3 is 4. You know, we can define a variable called test and say that variable is equal to, you know, A, B, C, D. And then we could say, you know, test.to uppercase or whatever we want to do. We can just play around here in this console just like we would in the Node Dev interactive. Yes.
One language is
just JavaScript. This is a JavaScript console, similar to how Node is a JavaScript console, just one that is on your command line. Yeah, so this is a JavaScript console. Now, if you get like, there's a few versions of Chrome that aren't like the popular, like the main version that will run other like experimental languages, but sort of. No, not Scheme, unfortunately, but there is one called Dart. That's sort of a up-and-coming Google language that they may introduce into the browser in 10 years, something. All right, so we're going to go and check out this Sources tab, okay? And we're going to talk about a few things that are happening here. So we've already come to this tab when, you know, when we click those errors, those links bring us to this tab, to the Sources tab. And that's because this tab has all of the files loaded on the page on this left-hand side. And here is like a viewer, so we can click files on the left-hand side and view them here, their contents here. We can also do a bunch of debugging in this tab, okay? So, you know, more formal debugging than adding console log statements. This is a formal debugger, as we'd call it. It's a program used to debug other programs, okay? And so this is how it works. What we're going to do is we're going to find in this code, you know, sort of the area of interest. So we know the problem with this program is that you know, when we hit that minus button. So when we go to decrement. Now, you know, you have to suspend disbelief for a second. The problem here is probably pretty obvious already. But we're going to use the debugger to kind of see how we would look through this problem in a more sophisticated way than just console logging. Okay? So what we can do is each of these line numbers are actually clickable. Okay? And when we click a line, say line 46, it'll give us this blue arrow next to it. So I clicked on line 46 in this, and it gave me this little blue arrow there. That is called a breakpoint. Okay? So when I add that blue marker there, that's called a breakpoint. And what that does is it tells my program, hey, when you hit this line, stop doing anything. Just stop and wait for me. And I can kind of suspend the program and look inside and see what's happening. Okay? And once I'm there, I can then step through my code line by line and see what's happening on each line of the program and how it's affecting everything else. Okay? So let's see what that looks like. So we've got this breakpoint here. Well, we know we're not going to hit that breakpoint until we click on that minus button, right? So let's do that and see what happens. Okay, oh, I clicked a bit too hard. So you'll notice a few things happened. Okay, so we've hit this breakpoint. The first thing you'll notice is a dim gray sort of overlay goes over your web page, and you get in the center this yellow bar with a play sign. Okay, so essentially what's happened is our program is now paused. Okay, it's paused and it's waiting for us to tell it what to do. Okay? We also get this line here that's saying, hey, here's where the program is right now. It's on this line. It hasn't yet executed line 46. It's about to execute line 46. All right. Now, I'm missing some of my, this is hard to do so zoomed in. But I actually want this over here. I think it's because I'm too zoomed in, but this might be on the right-hand side for you, but there's a few more windows here. And the one that we care about is this panel here right now. And this panel here is like navigation through our program. So here we are, we're paused on line 46. This is getting a little cramped. Let me zoom out one level, see if I can make some. There we go. So now this probably looks more like yours. On the right-hand side, we've got these controls here. So this button here, this one will step to the next line. So it's called a step over. It steps to the next line. Okay, so if I wanted to now make 46 run and go to line 47, I could do that by hitting that button. Okay. This next button here, that's a step into. Okay. So if, like on 47, the line that we're on is a function call, I can step into that function, okay, and see what happens when that function runs. The one next to that is the step out of. So if I'm inside of a function call, I can step out of that function call, back to whoever called it, wherever it was called. All right, and then this play button will just let the program continue. Okay, so that's the first thing, some of our navigation controls. The next thing that we're going to look at and pay close attention to is this scope section. So this scope section will show us all of the variables that exist in our program and what their values are. So you'll notice we have this variable this, and remember this is the thing that was clicked on, the button with the ID minus. Okay? So we already knew what this is, but now we can kind of see for sure it's the button with ID minus. And if you notice, if I hover over that, it'll actually show me where that button is in the DOM. So I'm hovering over that. It'll actually show me which element that is that I'm looking at here in the debugger. So the other thing so this is the local scope, the current local scope. Well, there's not much going on. There's no variables or functions declared in this local scope. All we've got is this. Our model for this program exists in the global scope, right? It's declared at the very top of the file, outside of all the functions. It's in the global scope. So I'm going to open up this global, Well, there's a bunch of stuff in here, but we know that our model is called count. It's called count, and this is in alphabetical order, except for things that start with uppercase come before things that start with lowercase. So we're gonna have to scroll pretty far down, and eventually we'll find count. Everybody see that? Everybody able to find count in the global scope? So count has currently a value of -1. Okay? So we want to know what's going on here that is causing our program to behave so abnormally. So let's do this. Let's step to the next line. Let's let 46 run and see what happens to count. So I'm going to click the step over button, this button here, and that's going to take us to line 47. I'm then going to open the global scope again. And if I can find count, I'll see, count is now -3. So now that I've stepped to the next line, that line has done its job. And what it's done is it's subtracted 2 from that number. So I know the problem happened on line 46. Now, probably could have figured that out a lot sooner, but oftentimes it's not quite as obvious. So now that we know what the problem is and we know where it is, we can go fix it. But let's just, as an experiment, let's use the step in. So if we were to step over, this function would stop and we'd go back to wherever we were before we called that function. But we're going to use this step in to go inside of the render count function. Okay, so I'll step in. And we're now inside of the render count function. And so now that we're in here, we can step through this function using the step over. Right, so we just console logged something. I should see made it to render. Just appeared in the console if I flip back to the console. I can step over this line. Sometimes it takes more than one step because there's multiple things happening on the line. But now that I'm on line 9, I can see, okay, what's the value of this source variable? So before we console logged it to see what the value was, now if we're stepping through, we can just look right over here. And we can see, oh, it's this. You can also just put your mouse over it, and it will show you in sort of this dialog here. So you can just put your mouse right over the variable you're interested in, and it'll show you what is the current value of that variable. Okay, we can step through here. Well, what's in that template? Well, that template is now a function, just like we thought it was. All right, we're going to console log some stuff. We're going to create that HTML, and if we hover over that, now we can see that the rendered HTML is this string that has a span in it. And we can step over that, and we saw, it's hard to see on my screen, but we saw that that number just changed right as we stepped over line 23. So now we can just let the program run by hitting the play button. And we know the issue now. We can go back and fix it. So let's just go back, to round this out. Fix this. Well, instead of subtracting 2, we'll just subtract 1 by decrementing. And now we should be able to refresh. And I can get rid of this breakpoint because I think it's going to work, so I'm just going to get rid of that breakpoint. I can just click it again to get rid of it. Press play. And there we go. So now we fixed our program. Questions about the debugger? Now, obviously, there are a lot of features here that we didn't use. Chrome DevTools is probably a JavaScript developer's Swiss Army knife. I mean, this is really the most powerful set of tools that you can use in front-end development. You can even, most people who write Node even use the Chrome debugger in order to debug their programs. Question?
You're saying that compared to other browsers?
Oh yeah, definitely compared to other browsers. developer tools, but even non-browser tools. Chrome is just the best in class. And that's why developers really use Chrome, not so much because the browser functionality is better, but because the dev tools are just really far superior than anything else. Other questions? Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to take another application with bugs, and you're going to start debugging it on your own. So if you look back in Sublime, we've got this payment form program. And it's got some JavaScript here, and I'll just let you know that there are some issues with this JavaScript that you're going to have to fix. I'll show you real quick what it should look like when it works, just so we know. I'll be over here. Okay, so this is what it should look like when it's functional. So it's a payment form, and down here we've got like a little mock credit card. So as the user fills this out, we should see, oops, the credit card kind of come to life. So you might have seen an application like this in the past, online shopping or something. So that's what it should look like, when it works, right? We should see this credit card being slowly filled out. But the version in starter code has some bugs in it. So go ahead and use, some of these tools that we just talked about to try to fix that program and make it work like this. So a lot of debugging is sort of narrowing down, where could the problem be? Once you've narrowed it down to a line or two, it makes it a lot easier to kind of figure out what's going on. Yeah, yeah.
Fall asleep.
I never really noticed that. Thank you. Beautiful. Not that this matters, but there are 7. So this is JavaScript for Node.
Yeah.
So looks like you're mixing browser JavaScript and Node JavaScript.
So I need to separate it. How do I call this file?
So you can type in Node, put it up there. Right, so in order to make this run from the browser, you have to have a Node server.
Yeah, I do. That's fine.
So this has to be in your Node server.
It is.
Okay. And so then you have to have an endpoint, a URL, that when hit calls.
So I would do the URL of this file specifically. So if I just type it in the browser.
So I mean, it's not going to work out of the box.
So here's the full
So
site
what-
index. Here's the Twitter. I'm running on a bit now.
So like when you say you have a Node server, you've done like HTTP server -p, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what I mean when I say Node server is you're gonna have to write a Node file that has what we call URLs inside of it. So you know the HTTP server is just for files. Well, you need to actually run JavaScript on the server in order to run this.
Okay.
So the easiest way to do that is to use something called Express.
This is sweet.
A library called Express.
I've installed Express.
Yeah.
I don't know what it does.
So Node has a library for making HTTP endpoints or URLs that receive requests.
Yeah, connect and serve are two ones that I installed. And that's
Yeah,
my-
those are really simple. The regular one is very good, but Express is a way to do that a lot if you want. So just you give it like a path, like / log into Twitter or whatever, and you give it a function. And then you would say, instead of HTTP server, you would say node myserver.js.
in the actual. So I have to create an Express server and not use the server code that I'm using.
Correct, because just a regular file server isn't capable of running code.
I see. This is going to be quite the project.
Yeah. Do you have any questions?
I just
Part of debugging is a little bit of struggle.
can you do it not HTML? This is an IDE script.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the reason you can tell that that works is you use the debugging. So like on the line after that is that source of code.
So what do I define a breakpoint here?
Yeah, you can do that. Any of those on the
And then how do I run it? Do I just refresh the page?
Yeah, or you could, when is that function called?
This function is called to it's within the breakpoint.
Yes, you have to refresh.
That's
So then you get another point. So now you're here. So you will see, is this template source here? Well, you hovered over it, you saw it. So hover over it, hover over it. Yeah, it looks good, right?
yeah, yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So you can see it. So that is in,
Okay. I'm getting an error. This is not. So that's why I was looking for this. Oh. It says template source is not defined. Okay, so where is that in? It says it's occurring on the line 22. Yeah, so remember, when it has an error, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it has the value undefined. It means that the variable with that meaning has never been declared. Okay. So it's a scope issue. Could be a scope issue. Could be a scope issue. Okay. If you happen to make it to this really quickly, there's some bonus video later to tell you some more advanced so it's basically interactive. It wants you to. Okay, so alright, so
So it's not necessarily a sense of how you're supposed to swap it. It's visually
this is
that may not be
so you know we're getting inside that.
but you notice that the
You know that's different, but getting inside that.
you might declare hard indicator very object as a variable. So you might constantly unlock it in your workflow. You might call out code, grabbing that, and you say, well, if that's not, then I don't set up your gravity thing, then either I haven't assigned that ID or anything, then nothing indicates the ID, or that's missing. Right? That's not.
And if that's right, then only my brain is that is not. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
My brain already knows what I so.
Okay. But you're ready to say about console logging?
Yes.
Okay. I'll go through it again. Okay. So go back to your code. So if you're going to below line
Should
25, bar L, there's like there, and then console logging up. Okay, return is undefined. Yeah.
It's all about hearing that. Obviously, like it's gonna happen. It makes it all there.
Probably detected manually. Usually, like there's JavaScript. You can write into like each for add a.
There it is.
Okay, there, appreciate it. So, for okay, how would I know the console logs you So, in this flow right here, so if you're gonna have this slide, right, you're like, well, it's not working. And you see, well, L is gonna get returned. So try that. Hello. It's not good. It's not good. jQuery, Victor returning back. And an object with like a 0, you can define anything with that. Does that make sense? How's that? So that's just something that's you have to something like that's what Jupyter returns to, right? right? So in other words, if you had a slide that's like class,
Because it's not cost.
class like
So you have to do something that gets it to it.
card section, right? A class card section.
So
When you had 40 elements in that class, you return an
lots
object,
in that memory card.
40
So when is the memory card?
40 things back, right?
Oh, sorry, sorry.
Sometimes you can do this.
Sorry, return an object,
Go back to
So that's,
So
that's here.
in this case, it's not finding anything with that ID, therefore
So now I was trying to actually it might be easier to see if you hover over it on the left hand side and you hover over that variable. But you don't actually put it into the browser until after this invite to actually gets inserted. So since we haven't run that line yet, we're not going to see it. So if you step over it, after
So does any of the page have
now see it.
itself?
So,
I'm asking, is there anything on the page have that?
How do we find out
Probably.
Well, I'm asking you to ask that, I'm asking, yeah,
So,
yes,
well, go
no.
ahead and.
No,
Let's play.
so because the answer is no,
When is that?
it'll say that January, return is zero, because it found nothing. That makes sense? Like if something in the road had that ID, jQuery would return something in that element.
Because this is,
So this input has a.
So like the fact that it's a typo in this case is just,
So it's
that's just one case,
It's
it
happening.
could be like you forgot to write the ID.
Deposit and break.
You
And
know,
you can see
you've
that.
got other issues, you got something else not working correctly, right? This is just one issue where, one case where you return out, right?
So now you can
So
see.
typos are the only instances. This
You see
just
that part
happens.
of now.
Does that make sense? So because that ID, because nothing
Yeah,
on the page has that ID,
that's
it returns,
it is now.
right, it returns this. So that's fine, we'll link zero. So if you correct that, and then it pops up, if you correct the typo, and then it pops up log like that, will return, you can see, in this case, now it's
So that's why
finding
we're
that
going
on the page.
we should see that.
Oh, I see. Okay. So we know what's the.
So something, so what happens
Yeah,
is we look at.
now you should see console ML is gonna have. So you can add it. That makes sense.
This is how we're.
If you want to get more, returns to you, that's.
So
You
it's
can
either
either
it's wrong.
on like zero, and that's, that
Because
you
remember, we want that to be the last.
how many things had that.
For some reason, it's against storage. If you try to make it next last week.
One thing. Yeah. Although you could have.
Yeah, so you are signing it, so you are
I mean,
having.
I guess you could have just bad practice. Yeah. So in that case, right, what I would advise probably is that console log everything, right? This is that's a jQuery selector, console log. Console log. Anything that where there's communication.
So it's like a-
In this case,
So we always start, so type in something. Things like.
yeah, no problem. Yes, that's sort of console log and everything. It's very minor.
So we need to do
Very,
that.
very important.
It's going, I haven't even set a break.
You're able to see everyone, yes, bro. Yes.
So that we can see it. So.
Someone here has fun cameras. Also, silence.
So it's gonna make this somewhere inside.
What?
Remember that.
Question I wanna-
Okay, so.
So now it's like.
Do you know what it's being?
So now you should be able to step through.
And that is a function rendered by the You're getting that back.
This, yeah, and turning back to just sweet.
All right, I'm gonna start going through this up here real quick, just because we want to get through it. You have a lot of practice with this. The homework is this, but like to the nth degree. Like it's not only is it debugging, but it's gonna be debugging code that's a little bit less familiar. So you're really gonna have to put these tools to the test in order to make some sense of it. But for now, let's go ahead and look at this together. I'm gonna close this working one, and I'm gonna open up the one you all are looking at. Okay. So right away we notice, the card isn't showing up. So something is wrong here. Probably, if this is the first time we've opened our program, 9 times out of 10, we've probably made some sort of syntax error. This happens to everybody. Every time you first write a program, especially if you write a lot of code without checking any of it, probably the first time you open it up, there's going to be something wrong. And so what we're going to do is we're going to open up the console. And yep, just like we thought, there's a red error here, right? So these ones are the nice ones. These ones are the easy ones to fix. We can just click this link. It's on index line 6. And okay, well, we notice, we forgot to put a variable here, a value here after the card number. So we've got this card number key, but we forgot to put a value. And that's not, proper JavaScript, so we're getting a syntax error. So I'll go into my index.js file, and we'll go ahead and add that value there. Okay, come back, I'll refresh. All right, looks like we still got an error here. So I'll go back to the console. Unexpected token, semicolon, another syntax error. Check that one out, it's on line 8. So we also, not only did we forget a value in this object, but we also improperly used a semicolon where it wasn't legal. So I'll go ahead and erase that semicolon. I think everybody got those. So we'll refresh again. Okay, no more red errors, but we got something happening in the template here. In the console. So we've seen this one before too, right? It says template source is not defined, reference error. Right? So reference error means what? Yes, we're referring to something that was never defined or never declared, right? It does not mean that the value of that variable is the value undefined. It does not mean that. What it means is the variable or function was never declared in the first place, right? So we never said var something equals or var something semicolon, right? We never did that. That's what this error means. It doesn't at all mean that the value is the value undefined, right? That would be okay. That might not do what we think it should, but it wouldn't give us an error in the console. So it's saying that this is happening on index.js on line 19. So I'm going to go ahead and look there. Okay, well I see there's a template source variable, created here, declared here. So if the error is happening right here, I'm clearly declaring a variable that I think is the same right here. Then it's got to be a spelling issue. The only thing that really could be going on here is I've got a spelling issue. And if you look closely, you'll see that template source is missing the E. And so I'll go back to Sublime. So here we have template source with the E. On this line, we got an error. It said that this word here, that thing wasn't defined, it's never declared. Well, the reason it's saying that is because we just missed an E. Okay, let's go back, refresh again. Okay, we still got something going on. Another exception here, .jQuery.htm is not a function, a type error. Okay. Well, this one's pretty clear. What's the issue here? Right, we mistyped here. HTM should be HTML, like the jQuery function we know. So what type is .htm? Does anybody know what type.htm is? It's not a function, because if it were a function, we wouldn't get a type error here. So we know it's a type that is not a function. We don't type it might be. No guesses? Yeah. Okay, is it a string? So if we access a key on an object that hasn't been defined in that object, what is the value at that key? Undefined. So .htm is never defined in jQuery, and thus it's undefined. That's the value of .htm. So we're trying to call undefined like it's a function. Undefined, not a function. Thus we get a type error.
I thought you asked what HTML was.
Oh, sorry. No, I was asking what is HTM.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
sorry. No, yeah, you're right. HTML function. Okay, so let's go back and let's fix that. This is on index line 24. Okay. Come back here, we'll refresh again. All right, our console is clean. We love that. But sadly, we still don't see our credit card. Okay, so there's still an issue. Still something going on. So we'll do, we could go in and add some console logs. That's a totally cool thing to do. But I'm going to do those. I'm going to jump straight to the debugger. So I'm just going to jump straight to the debugger in my sources tab. First thing I'm going to say is, is this render card function ever called? And one way we saw we could do that was we could add a console log as like the first thing that happens in that function. Another thing we could do is we could just set a breakpoint on the first line of that function. Now, we can't set that breakpoint here on line 22. Why can't we set it on line 22? Does anybody know? Yeah. Correct. On line 22, all we're doing is defining a function, and thus that's going to happen as soon as the file loads. Okay? So as soon as the browser loads the file, it's going to run line 22 to define the function. It's not actually going to run line 22 when the function runs. When we call the function, we're going to start at line 23. Okay, so when we want to debug inside of a function, we have to make sure to put the breakpoint on the first line in that function or some line inside the function, not, for instance, on line 25 or 22. Okay, so I've got my breakpoint there. I'm just going to go ahead and refresh the page. Command R, if you don't know. And when I refresh the page, okay, my breakpoint is hit. So right now, I'm going to check a few things. Well, I know because I'm on line 23 where var card HTML is created, because I'm on that line, I know that line is going to be undefined at least until I go to the next line. So it's undefined at least until I run this line, which I haven't yet. I'm waiting to run this line. So that being undefined doesn't really tell me much. But I could see like, okay, what is my card info? Well, my card info looks pretty good. It's got this card number, CVV, expiration, first name, last name. They're all just empty strings because the user hasn't started filling it out yet. So that looks pretty good. What about my template source? Does my template source look okay? Well, I can go up here. Well, actually, I can't because I'm not in that scope right now. So I can't look at that. But I can look at my template here and say, okay, this is a function like it's supposed to be. That looks good. So let's step over this and see what happens to that card HTML. Okay, this card HTML is, some rendered HTML here. It looks like HTML. It doesn't have any of the handlebar sort of placeholders in there, so it's properly being rendered. We haven't yet set any of these values, so this is pretty much what we'd expect. So we've narrowed it down, right? We know that we're rendering the template correctly. This HTML is now correct. Now that we fixed it, we're passing it the HTML that we know is rendered correctly. So now we've narrowed this down to one chunk of code here, right? It can only be this thing here. This is the only thing left that we haven't verified. And the issue is, once again, a misspelled CSS selector. And this is going to happen to you so many times. And so, knowing how to look for these things and how to narrow it down to that, chunk of piece of code is really key. So, if we look at this closely, container is spelled wrong with an I before the A. So if we go back to here, and one way we could verify this, right, is we could just take this, Control-C, go into our index, Command-F to search, and we could just paste that. And if we hit enter there, it's not finding it. So we know that this ID doesn't even exist in our HTML. So obviously when we try to put it in there, it's not going anywhere because we don't have that in our HTML. So we'd look a little bit closer and we'd see the card, oh, that's the wrong index. So we'll search the correct index. We see that the container for the card is spelled differently with the A before the I. So I'll take that back and fix that up. Okay, let's let this play. I'm just going to remove my breakpoint and refresh. And now, lo and behold, we've got a credit card. Okay, so let's try the next thing, which is, well, when we go ahead and start typing, we want to see those updates live in the credit card, right? That's sort of the goal here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Oops, I'm in the wrong place. Start typing my name. Well, okay, nothing's happening. I can look here. Well, no errors in the console. So, no syntax errors, anything like that. It's got to be a problem with our logic or something of that nature. So let's look at the code. Where can we set a breakpoint that will get called anytime I type in a character? So where can we set a breakpoint that will get called, when I type in a character? Yeah. Exactly. Right? So the function that's running when I type in that character is in the event listener callback, right? The event listener function. So if we look at our code, here we can see .on. We know .on is used to attach the event listener. And what we're doing is we're finding all of the text inputs. That's a CSS selector for all of the inputs that have a type text, right? So all of those type text inputs, we're finding all of those, and whenever the input event happens, so there's an input event that gets called every time a user types a key in an input. That's an event that we can listen to. Whenever that event happens, we're going to run this callback function, okay? This anonymous function that we put into that on. So if we want to, remember, debug inside of a function, the way we do that is by setting a breakpoint in that function. Okay, so I'm just going to set a breakpoint right here on line 36, and we'll see what happens. Don't really know what I'm looking for yet, but I know it's going to happen here, whatever it is. So the way I can make this function get called and make us hit this breakpoint is by doing what? By typing in a letter. Right? That's how this function gets called, and that's how we can reach this breakpoint. So I'm going to type in a letter here. Okay, and as soon as I type that letter in, we get the gray overlay, we get the pause symbol, and we get the blue line telling us that we've stopped or paused right here on line 36. Okay, so if I look at this, right, I hover over it, telling me that it's this input right here. That's what we want, right? And I'm using .val to get the value out of that. So far, that looks pretty good. Let me go ahead and step over that line. Again, there's several things happening, so I might have to hit it more than once. Now, if I hover over entered value, okay, I got that F. Okay, so I got that F out of that input, just like I was hoping to. So far, so good. Okay, now, I want to find what is the name attribute of the input that we just, that we were just typing in. Okay, so if you look back at the HTML, each of these inputs has a name attribute that matches the key in the model. Right, so there's a card info object that is our model, and each of those keys lines up with one of these name things. Now, we wouldn't necessarily have to know that in order to keep debugging, so let's just step over and let's see, okay, what is that input key? Okay, input key is first name. Okay, that's a little weird in and of itself, but okay, interesting. Now, we're going to update the card info model here. This comment says we're going to update the model by putting the entered value, F, into the object. So let's see what happens when we do this. Okay, let's look at this card info object now. So what do you notice here? So if we're looking at this object, what do you notice about the keys here? Yeah. Right. And what is that F supposed to be? Yeah. It should be, I'm not really sure where I was typing, but it should be either the first or last name, right? It's not, it shouldn't be this random property input key. Okay, so obviously we've done something wrong when we were updating that model. Okay, so the error has to be on line 42. That's what happens, you know, on line 42, we did something that caused our model to get messed up. Does anybody know what we did wrong? Yeah.
Instead of input, it should do this because you should get an attribute for the what you just click on and not for like all inputs.
Oh, yeah, exactly. There's an issue there too. I didn't stop on that one, but you're right. When we got the attribute name, you're absolutely right. The reason I typed it, remember, in this last name. I typed it in this last name, but the input key I got was first name. It's kind of weird, right? The reason that happened was because we got all of the inputs, and it just took the name attribute of the first one, which happens to be first name. So we got the value out of the one that was being typed in. We should have also got the name attribute out of one that was first typed in. So we should have used this here as well. Does everybody see that? So here we got all of the inputs, and we just took the name of the first one. But what we really want is to take the name of the one that's being typed into. So let's do that first. Let's go back to our JS. So we properly used this here, but down here we used input instead of this.
But the input for the var input key, I mean, it is a selector, but it's still selecting the inputs. You don't have to put the type text. So wouldn't that? I mean, it's not well formed. But wouldn't input still work?
Well, did it work? We typed something in the last name input, and we got the name of first name. So what happened was we were not just selecting the input we're typing in, we're selecting all of the inputs.
Oh yeah, gotcha.
And we were taking the name of the first one. But what we wanted to do is take the name of the one that we're actually typing, this.
Okay, that makes sense. That's what I was about to say. I'm like, it's still a good selector, but I didn't take into account.
Right.
Multiple selectors.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. It's a pointer.
So, okay, let's check that much. Let's go ahead and refresh. So when I type in, I'm going to do this in last name again so we can reproduce the problem. I type in F. I step over this line. I get entered value. F looks good. Now let's get the name attribute. Okay, and this time it correctly says last name. Okay, so let's step over line 42 again. And let's look at card info. All right, we still have a problem, don't we? We still have a problem here. We updated some key, input key, instead of updating the last name of our model. So we updated some input key instead of last name of model. So tell us why. Exactly. So an important thing to note, when we're using a variable key, okay, when we're using a variable key for an object, in this case, we have a variable input key. This is a variable key. It could be one of any number of things. When you use a variable key, you must use bracket notation. You must use bracket notation if you're using a variable key. And the reason is, this thinks that we want to update something that's literally called input key. Okay. So if we look at this object again, what we see is there's now a property that's literally called input key. That's not what we want. We wanted to update the last name, which is the value of the input key variable. Okay, so we wanted to update last name, and if we look over here, last name is the value of the input key variable. So when we're using variable keys in objects, we must use bracket notation. Oops. Yes?
So is that a way to just add objects?
Yeah, that's exactly what we were doing. We were adding a new property to an object called input key.
Is that like valid?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, it is something that trips people up in this situation, but it's totally valid. I mean, 9 times out of 10, when we're using objects, we'll use dot notation. This is one situation where we don't have that option, and that is when we're using a variable key. So a key that is a variable. Okay, so let's refresh this page and see what happens. I'm going to type in F now. We'll step over that line. Entered value looks good. Step over that line. Input key looks good. It says last name. I'm going to step over this line. Now let's look at our card info. And look, last name has been updated to have an F in it. So now when we look at the model, it looks great. We've gotten rid of that extra input key property that wasn't being used for anything, and we've actually updated the last name, which is what we wanted. So let's go ahead and hit play and see, if that worked. Okay, lo and behold, we've got an F. So let's try filling. I'm going to get rid of this breakpoint, and I'm going to attempt to just fill this out. Okay, so far so good. All right, looks like we got it.
I'm still a little confused as to why location input did not work in this work, because isn't this referencing the selector in the function?
It's not, yes, that's a great point. It is not referencing this selector. This does not represent the selector. What it represents is the specific DOM element where the event occurred.
Yeah.
Okay? So there's a difference, right? Here we're finding all of the inputs, and we are attaching an event listener to all of them. This here is the specific input that actually had an input event. Okay? So this is one, by necessity, this is one DOM element. This is the first name element, the last name element, the zip code element, or whatever it is, the card number element, etc. All of those. So here, when we select all of the inputs again, and we say .attr name, we're going to get the name attribute of the first one, which happens to always be first name.
I mean, you're right. It was bugged.
Yeah, totally.
Until I switched to this, I just was trying to.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
No, it's a great point to bring up. Any more questions about this before we take a break? Yes. Sure. So this we know, right? This is getting that input that we were typing in. The .attr jQuery function, do we know what that does? Do you know what that does? Exactly. It looks for an attribute. Do you know what an attribute is?
For example, style.
Exactly.
attribute.
It's one of these, right? In HTML, it's a name equals value pair, right? That's an attribute in HTML.
Right, the attribute name, yeah.
Exactly. So it's looking specifically for the name attribute. Okay? And it's getting that value and it's storing it in this variable here called input key. Okay? So when we type, that is either going to be first name, last name, card number, expiration, or CVV, depending on which one we're typing in. Okay? So far okay? All right. We now know that this input key here is a variable that has one of those 5 things inside of it. Okay? It's a variable that stores one of those 5 things. If we were to do this, okay, if we were to use dot notation here, what we're saying is put a key literally called input key, INPUTKEY. Put that key into this object card info. Okay. When we do this, what we're saying is put a value in your value in the place at the value of input key, the variable. Okay, so the value.
Now you're putting a key into the object with the brackets. You're taking the value of the key that's there.
Right, because this is a variable here, the variable will be evaluated for whatever its value is, which will either be first name, last name, CVV, expiration, card number, and we will be inserting the thing at that key of the value of input key. The other way, we are actually putting a new key in there called input key, which is not what we want. What's another time? Does anyone remember another time where we have to use bracket notation with objects? There's one other situation that comes up occasionally that we need to use bracket notation necessarily for objects. We can't use dot notation. You know, Phil?
When the key is not.
Yeah, exactly. When the key has special characters in it, such as a space or other special characters, whenever the key has special characters in it, we have to use bracket notation, and we do it like this. So if I had a key that says "Hello World," I would have to use bracket notation in order to do that because it has that space in there. So dot notation isn't going to work. Awesome. Okay, let's take another break. Oh, it's getting late. Let's take another quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll round out the evening.
As always. Okay. So I get what you're saying. There needs to be 2 servers. There needs to be your normal Apache server, which is just serving files and everything like that.
You could combine them into one.
I don't want it.
Okay.
So then you have your Express server, which is listening on a different port. And that's what you're actually calling to and calling back from with the Twitter OAuth, right?
Exactly.
So, but except for when I try and access port 3000, it doesn't give me anything. Well, I know that it's running, so here's my example I have right now. Port 3000. Okay, I can even show you and I even did a generator. I used Express generator to actually generate all this. And I did it here. And I know it's running because I did a netstat to check the port, but the difference was
Step away for a while. Step away, come back.
You did a netstat on your students?
Yeah. So it was like this. It was one of these down here. So like. Sorry. So it is running like this. You see the difference between that and maybe.
That's okay. It just means it's listening on any IP address.
So when I did this as 80, when I was like, hey, let me see if I can replace the server, it did list hello world. It said hello world.
So yeah, probably the issue is that initial thought that whatever shared host you're on doesn't expose other ports to the internet. Because each port has to have extra white. It's okay if this port be accessed from outside.
So I need to look up
Something called
on
like IP tables, is like probably the program share uses to say which
That's the next step in
ports are
So what I need to do is, I have my own dedicated ID.
What operating system?
Debian.
So
It's a bitnet. It's a yeah. So it's a bitnet cloud Google Cloud hosted node server.
yeah, so you can do a couple of things. You can Google like operating system name, make ports open. You can Google like host name, maybe open up things. We're gonna just do some more AJAX stuff a little bit, introduce a couple more concepts, but they're all very similar to what we did last class. It's definitely recording. Check a couple things.
Okay, so I'll check.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much.
No problem. See you Tuesday.
The other homework is
You do have homework. It's in the slides. It's on the GitHub repo.
along with coming up with concept that we're going
Correct. Yes.
to.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's get back to it. We've got a few more things to talk about today. So obviously, the last step here is like, well, if you haven't been able to solve it, use Google. Get good at using Google. It's a very powerful tool. Learning how to use the right keywords to find the answers to problems is probably the key skill of programming. Right? Any error message that you get is probably got a Stack Overflow page. So use Google to the best of your abilities. I think that's it there. All right, so we're going to talk about a couple more things related to AJAX. Yes, question.
So for level 4 debugging, 5 years from now, can we still
Yes. We leave these Slack channels open. People still contact me, asking me, hey, I've got this little bug. Do you mind taking a peek? 9 times out of 10, I have time to do that. So, your results may vary, but in general, I am a resource even after the class. Okay, so we're going to talk about some more stuff related to AJAX. Specifically, we're going to talk about this thing called an event object, and we're going to talk about how that relates to forms. So we mentioned forms last class and how they work in traditional applications. We're going to look to see how we can use forms in our modern single-page applications that use AJAX. Okay. So every time we've used jQuery's.on to attach an event listener, and we've done this many times now, every time we've done it, we've created an event listener with no parameters, right? So for instance, in that, in the thing we were just working on, right? We're listening to this input event on the input text, and we have this function here, no parameters. Just like when we did add to-dos or delete to-do or mark complete, all of those event listeners, they had no parameters. It turns out that every event listener can have an optional parameter, and we typically call that parameter event. Again, we name our parameters. We could call it anything we want. Some people write EV. Some people put E. But we can call it whatever we want. But what it is the event that caused this function to be called. Okay? So the argument that we get there is an object that represents the event that occurred that made this function get called. Okay, so what does that mean? When a user clicks something and an event listener is run, that event listener will get this optional argument here that represents a click event. Okay? So if you think of that click event as an object, a JavaScript object, that gets passed into this function. It has a bunch of properties that we could potentially use. It has a dot type, it has a type property, and that's always going to match, the event that happened. So event.type here, this is a click handler, so the event.type is a click. Right? It has a target, okay? And the target is the DOM element where the event occurred, right? Which sounds familiar, right? It's the DOM element where the event occurred. Event.target is equal to this. Okay? So if I were to log is event.target equal to this, I would get true because those two things are the same inside of an event listener. Yes?
Or is that out of scope of this class? Into the whole of this stuff?
I can and will. We're going to have a whole week where we go back and talk about some language things, and we'll talk about like what this means in different contexts because it takes on different meanings depending on where it is. So in jQuery though, and in jQuery event listener specifically, it's always going to refer to the DOM element where the event occurred, right? So it's always event.target, which is also the DOM element where the event occurred. Yes.
So the first event and after do something, is that referring to the click? Like what is that event referring to?
Okay, so remember what we're passing here is a function. Okay? Somewhere inside of jQuery's .on, it's going to call whatever function we passed in. Okay? And when it calls it, it's going to hand it an object that represents the event that caused it to be called. Okay? So jQuery is passing us that argument. We don't actually ever see that argument in our code. Okay? So we never see that object in our code other than when we're in here. We're not actually, because we're never actually calling do something. Okay? So here we've defined do something. Here we're passing it in as a callback function, but we're never actually using those parentheses and calling it. That's happening somewhere inside of jQuery. And when jQuery does that, it gives us an object with various properties. That object will look something like this. Oops. So it'll use curly braces. That's how objects look. It'll have a type. In this case, it would be a click. It will have a target, and that will be some DOM element. So it's not, you can't really write a DOM element in JavaScript, but it would be a DOM element. And it'll have a bunch of other things. It'll have like position x, like where did that click occur on the x-axis? Like 1, 2, 3. It'll have position y, where did that event occur on the y-axis? 9, 7, 8, 9, or whatever it may be, and on. A bunch of information about that event and what happened.
That's all happening student.
Right. All of this, the creation of this object, the passing it to our function, all of that is happening inside jQuery.
Like the element, you're going to tell it which element.
Yeah, jQuery.
Say, ID something.
Well, yeah, when we do this, right? When we do the selector here, that's telling it where that event we care about is. So eventually this will become that event.target, or actually vice versa, but in any case, yeah, all of that happens within jQuery. We don't have to do that ourselves. Okay, so we get this event object, okay? So why is that useful? Well, there's a bunch of things we might do with this. If I can get this to move. Well, one, if we're listening to, say, a key press event, right? There's a key press event, which happens every time we press a key on the keyboard. That event object will contain, okay, which specific key was actually pressed? Was it the D key? Was it the enter key? Was it the backspace? Was it a /, et cetera, et cetera? That information will be inside of that event object. Other things that are in there, like I said, the coordinates where a click occurs or where an event occurs. So if I click it, it'll tell me, where exactly in the browser did that thing occur. Maybe I want to insert something there, and make some sort of effect happen where they clicked. I could use that information from the event object. Another thing we can do with the event object is we can prevent the browser from doing whatever its default behavior is. Okay? Okay, and why is that useful? Well, remember how last class we were talking about forms and how forms behaved in traditional front-end websites. In traditional websites, how a form behaves is when the user hits the submit button, it will refresh the browser, or it will make the browser go to a new web page. That web page is listed here in the action. Okay, so that's how forms initially were used. When I hit that submit button, it would cause the form to go to a new web page or refresh the current page. And that's what the browser wants to do when you submit a form. That isn't good for us because in our single page applications, if the page is refreshed, all of a sudden we lose all of our JavaScript context. Right? Our program restarts from the beginning, and if we're keeping score or doing something of that nature, it's going to reset to 0. Right? We're going to lose all of that context that we've built up over time. So what we want to do is we want to prevent the browser from doing that default behavior. We don't want it to refresh the page or go to a new web page. We don't want that. That would be bad for our single page application. So we can use that event object to prevent the default default behavior for that event. So in this case, we are listening on that login form for a submit event. Like I said, the default behavior for a submit event is to refresh the current page or to go to a new web page, depending on what the action is. And we don't want that, so we're just going to type in event.prevent default. And that's a function that will cause it not to do that behavior. Okay. So what this allows us to do is we can now, just use JavaScript how we've been using it. We can go to these individual inputs and get the values out of them, like we've done in previous event listeners. So here we're going to that email input, getting the value that was entered there. We're going to that password input, getting the value that's entered there, storing it in this data object. We can then use AJAX to send that data object ourselves. So rather than relying on the browser to send it by refreshing the page, we're going to use AJAX to go ahead and send that data ourselves. Okay? And this will allow us not to lose that JavaScript context when the form is submitted. Okay, so I just wanted to mention this. This is another way of making AJAX requests that's different than the way we looked at last time. And this one's necessary in certain situations. So last time we looked at .get, right? .get, jQuery.get to make an AJAX request. There's also a similar jQuery.post to do a post request. However, if you want to make a put request or a delete request, there is no shorthand function for that. I don't know why they chose arbitrarily to leave those two off, but they did. There's only a get and a post. Yes. Well, I mean, if you care about the response, yeah. If you care about the response or care about knowing when the response came back or if it was successful or any of those things, then yes, you will need a callback function. Yeah.
So, by expression, it sounds like you can leave it off, so you don't care.
Yeah, you could leave it off. You could leave it off. It wouldn't be wise, though, because at the very least, you probably want to know, like, was it successful or something of that nature. Or, you may want to update your UI, based on the, knowing that it's back. I can't think of a time when you would leave it off, but you could. Yeah, you could. Okay, so let's look at this .ajax. It's very similar, except for the way that we call it is a bit different. So if you'll remember, .get took two arguments. First was a URL string. Second was a callback function, right? What .ajax does, and what a lot of jQuery functions that are more complicated do, is they take a settings object or an options object. So they take a single parameter, single argument, that is an object with all of the options. Okay? So rather than having a URL and then a callback function, it has a single object that has all of that information in it. Okay, so here we're calling jQuery.ajax, open, close parentheses. We're passing it a single argument, this object. This object can have a bunch of properties, probably about 100 that you can put in here. But today, the only ones that we really care about are this type, which is the HTTP method to use. In this case, we're going to do a GET request. You can do a delete or a post or a put here. You can also do those. The URL, which could be whatever HTTP URL we want to access. And then finally, in the success, we can give it a callback function to call when when this request is made successfully. Okay. All right. So we're going to go ahead and quickly together sort of use these two concepts. Okay. So we're going to go back to our to-do application. We're going to put in a form. And when that form is submitted, we're going to use jQuery.ajax to make an AJAX request. Okay? So let's go back to the starter code. And I'm going to close these. And let's open up to do AJAX. And I'm going to go straight to the JavaScript. First of all, let me open up the said I'm going to go straight to JavaScript, but I'm actually going to open the HTML. So notice what we've got here. We've got this submit input here that we've had before. Hello. Actually, it's not working. We've got a reference here. Render is not defined. Would you look at that? Not intentional. Let's go in this index.js file. We need to fix what we're calling render here to render to-dos. Yeah, so every time we were calling render before, we need to actually render to-dos. So there's one at the end of each of these functions, mark completed, delete to do, add to do. We need to render to dos instead of render. Putting those debugging skills to work. Okay, now that we've fixed that, let's go ahead and try this again. Okay, that worked. I'm going to type in world. Now, what this form is intended to do is we're going to type in a number here, and it's going to load that number of random to-dos. Okay, so if I type in 2, it's going to load 2 random to-dos. So right now when I hit this, okay, weird, right? What happened when I clicked that? Well, it took me to a new web page or a new URL, and that URL has 2 to-dos, but it's on a new page, and I've lost my whole UI. So obviously that's not exactly what we want. So again, when I hit this load button here, because this is a form, this is taking me just to a new web page, jacobfreeman.com, port 3000 to-dos, and this to-dos object, JSON here. So we've got to fix that problem. We're going to do that by using prevent default. So I'm going to hop back to Sublime. And let's take a look at the HTML again. So here we go. We've got this form, and this form has an action that goes to this URL. Okay, so this is how forms work traditionally, is they go to this action URL in the browser. And they do that by using the HTTP method that we reference here, which is the GET method. So what happens when we hit the submit button is it's just telling our browser, make a GET request, the whole page, make a GET request to the /todos URL, which is not what we want. What we want to do is when we submit this, go fetch that JSON using AJAX and then put it into our UI. So let's get that going. We'll go into our JS file here. We probably won't completely wrap this up today, which is okay. We can finish it on Tuesday, but we'll at least get it started. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen for that form submit event. Okay, so that every form has a submit event, and that event is the one that causes the browser to refresh or to go to a new page. So we're gonna listen for the form, and that form probably has an ID. I'm just gonna copy it so I don't accidentally code a bug. It's the load to-dos form. I'm gonna put in hashtag load to-dos form. And on its submit event, we're going to run a function. I'm going to call it load to dos. Okay, so we've added this new function here, or this new event listener here. We're finding that form, waiting for its submit event. And when it happens, we're running this load to dos function. Okay, so we have to define load to dos. I'm going to do it right here, just so we can keep it all in sight. Well, we know this is a function, load to dos. And all of our other event listeners, we've just done this and we were done. What do we need to change about this one?
Event default.
Well, right, but what do we need to do before we can do that? Exactly. We need to add the event as a parameter to the function. Now that we have access to that event object, we can use the event.preventDefault. Okay? Now, let's just test this much in the browser, and then we'll finish up making the AJAX call next class, because we're running out of time. But let's go ahead and see, does that much work? So I'll refresh this. When I click 2, all that we really hope happens here is nothing, right? Because before it was going to that new web page with the JSON. All we really want to happen now is nothing. That would mean that that default event had been prevented. And when I click it, sure enough, nothing happens. And this time, nothing is what we expected. All right, so next class, we'll go ahead and use now the input from this event and that jQuery.ajax to finish up this assignment by making that final AJAX request. But I do have a few announcements that I wanted to make before the end of class, so I don't want to go over. I guess real quick, are there any questions about this before we move on?
Well, that's load to dos form is the ID.
Is the ID of the form?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, that's an important point to make. The submit event only happens on the form itself. The submit event doesn't happen, for instance, on the input or on the submit input even. It happens on the submit form. So we have to listen for that event on the form. Okay, a couple things before we part. There is an assignment this weekend. There's a link here in the slides. There's a link on the GitHub repo. And let's take a quick look at this. Once again, it's a GitHub repo that you will fork, clone, work on, push, submit a pull request, right? Same workflow we used last week. This time, what I've given you is a MVC application, albeit a more sophisticated one that happens to be broken, okay? And it's got a number of bugs that you're gonna have to go through, use these debugging techniques to try to fix, all right? Let me go ahead and show you what it should look like when it's completed. Just for reference. Assignment 6. Okay, and all right, so here's what it should look like when it's been completed. It's a Trello-like sort of Kanban application. So you get these columns with individual tasks, and you should be able to drag and just drop these tasks from one column to another. So I can add a new one, say hello, or I'll make it more useful. Oh, sure, hello. And it should go into the to-do column, and then I can sort of just drag this to doing, and then to done. Okay? So that's how it should work. Also, I should be able to delete them using the X. And also, I should be able to load a random one from the server using AJAX. Okay? So I can load another one, load a few more, and I can just click and drag them around this place. Okay? So this is what it should do when it's functional. However, there are a bunch of bugs in it. So you're going to have to use your debugging prowess to go through this code and find the bugs and squash them. But it's going to, the code's going to be a bit unfamiliar, which makes the debugging challenge all the more hard because you got to really use those tools in sort of unfamiliar territory, which is a situation that you'll encounter a lot as a professional developer. Okay. One more announcement. We've got the final project again. I'll just remind you about this again. In the slides here, there's a link to the actual written out assignment, but once again, very open-ended. We just want to be using these skills to create some sort of front-end single-page application. Yeah?
The link to the assignment didn't work.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'll fix that. But in the GitHub repo, there's also a folder called Final Project, and that's what it should be linking to. However, it may or may not work. Again, though, it's pretty open-ended. I'll fix that link. But I do want you to submit, some sort of idea to me in one medium or another by the 25th when you turn in your next homework. Okay, so you can Slack it to me, you can email it to me, you can add it onto your pull request for the assignment. I don't really care. I just want to know, sort of what you're working on, so I can give you guidance as to whether or not that's too ambitious or not ambitious enough. Okay, questions about that? Perfect. All right. If you wouldn't mind, go ahead and fill out the exit ticket for class 12, and then have a good night. Also, for those of you who are interested, there are some really good YouTube videos on Chrome DevTools. So if you want to become like a Chrome DevTools power user, watch some of those YouTube videos, and see how the masters use it. I probably myself have only discovered like half the features because they're adding new ones all the time. And, it's very cool.